They called Pet Sounds the greatest album ever made, a cathedral of sound raised by a man who was, at that very moment, collapsing into rubble. How does a mind that could compose such celestial harmonies survive the wreckage of its own creator? This is the story of Brian Wilson, the genius buried alive, haunted by the voices in his head and the ghost of the father who tormented him. The melody was divine, but the childhood that forged it was a silent, punishing hell. Brian Wilson was born on June 20, 1942, in Inglewood, California, the eldest son of Murray and Audrey Wilson, and he grew up alongside his younger brothers Dennis and Carl in a household where their father was both an amateur musician and a violent tyrant. Murray Wilson, a man whose own musical ambitions had curdled into bitterness, subjected his children to a regime of psychological cruelty that he disguised as discipline, and Brian bore the brunt of it with his deaf right ear. From the time Brian was a small boy, his father would mock him with a sneer, calling him an idiot, telling him he was deaf and would never amount to anything, words that carved themselves into the child's developing mind. But the abuse was not merely verbal. There were beatings too, sudden explosions of fury that left the boys cowering, and Audrey, though loving, could not always shield them from the storm. How does a boy learn to trust the world when the first man he ever knows teaches him that love and violence are the same thing? The wound deepened when Brian was 12, for it was then that Murray, in a fit of jealous spite, sabotaged his son's budding musical education by telling the piano teacher that Brian had no talent whatsoever. The teacher, bewildered by the intrusion, eventually withdrew, and Brian internalized the verdict, carrying a sense of inadequacy like a stone in his chest for years to come. Yet here is the cruel paradox at the heart of the story. The same man who tore Brian down was also the man who first showed him the chords, who sat beside him at the family piano and placed his fingers on the keys. Murray Wilson, for all his monstrousness, genuinely loved music, and he passed that love to his son even as he poisoned it with his contempt. Brian's relationship with his father became a knot that he could never fully untangle, a desperate craving for approval from the very man he had the most reason to fear. He wanted to be seen, to be praised, to finally hear those words of affirmation that never came, and this hunger would drive him toward extraordinary achievement and extraordinary collapse in equal measure. Psychologists who have studied the case of Brian Wilson often point to him as a textbook example of how creativity can emerge from the crucible of childhood trauma rather than in spite of it. When a child learns to survive by constantly scanning for danger, his mind develops a hypervigilance that, in the right context, can become an astonishing attention to detail, a sensitivity to patterns and textures that others miss. The very anxiety that would later shatter Brian into pieces was the same force that allowed him to hear sounds inside his own imagination, with a clarity that was almost hallucinatory. He did not just hear a song. He heard the entire arrangement, every string, every harmony, every subtle shift in mood, and he believed that if he could only get it perfect enough, then maybe his father would finally look at him without contempt. It was a tragedy dressed in talent, because the perfection he chased was not really about the music at all. It was about earning the love of a man who was constitutionally incapable of giving it. Brian escaped into the music that his father had taught him, and as he grew, he began to hear vibrant symphonic sounds in his head that did not exist anywhere in the world yet. The domestic chaos, the shouting, the petty cruelties, they all receded when he sat at the piano, and he would play for hours, constructing cathedrals of sound in his mind to drown out the noise of his own life. His brothers looked to him with admiration, for he was their big brother, but they did not understand that he was breaking inside, that every note he played was an effort to repair an irreparable wound. By the time he was a teenager, Brian had developed an almost divine confidence in his own musical instincts, a strange compensation for the insecurity that his father had planted in him. He would reject what the radio was playing, insisting that he could do better, that he could hear something more beautiful, and his brothers, who worshipped him, were eager to believe him. What Murray Wilson did not realize as he mocked and belittled his son was that every cruel word was forging in Brian an emotional intensity that would one day be translated directly into song. The deep sadness you hear in My Room, that feeling of seeking refuge in a tiny private space away from the world, that was not an abstract exercise. That was Brian describing the only place he felt safe. The harmonies he would create with his brothers, those soaring stacks of voices, were as close as he ever came to speaking about the complicated, contradictory feelings he carried for the man who had taught him both music and fear. And so the foundation of a musical genius was laid not in gentle encouragement, but in the spent ache of a boy who was constantly trying to earn the approval of a father who saw him as a rival, a boy who never learned that he was already enough, a boy who would spend the rest of his life searching for a peace that his childhood never offered. By the time Surfin' Safari cracked the Billboard Top 20 in 1962, America was already surrendering to the image of golden California boys riding endless waves. Yet the man orchestrating the sound from a Los Angeles studio bore little resemblance to the carefree figure in the photographs. Brian Wilson was 20 years old, a colossally gifted but deeply fragile architect who had constructed a fantasy of sun-drenched freedom while the Cold War hummed its anxious frequency beneath the surface of American life. The Beach Boys became the voice of a carefree coast. But the real story was unfolding in rooms where no waves ever broke, where the only surf was the static of Brian's own escalating internal weather. He was not a performer in the traditional sense. He was a builder of sonic cathedrals, a studio obsessive who heard arrangements in his head that no one else could yet imagine, and that distance between the public fantasy and the private reality would become the first fracture in his psyche. The fracture announced itself without warning in June 1964, during a tour stop in Houston, Texas, when Brian Wilson collapsed into a panic attack so severe that he fled the stage and locked himself in his hotel room, trembling and unable to speak coherently. The documented breakdown, recalled by music journalist David Leaf in the film The Beach Boys, An American Family, marked the moment Brian realized he could no longer inhabit the role of touring frontman while his mind was quietly unraveling at the seams. He told the band he was done with the road, done with the planes and the buses and the faceless crowds, and that from that day forward he would remain in Los Angeles to write and produce while the others carried the Beach Boys' name across the country without him. It was a decision that saved his sanity in the short term, but sealed his isolation in the long, because the stage had been his only remaining link to the brothers and friends who still lived in the world he was abandoning. Glenn Campbell stepped into Brian's place on stage, a session guitarist with a honeyed voice who would later become a country superstar, and his tenure lasted from late 1964 into early 1965 before Bruce Johnston took over permanently. The fans in the audience rarely noticed the difference, and the records continued to sell, but the chemistry of the band shifted irrevocably, because the man who had created their sound was no longer in the room when they performed it. Brian, meanwhile, was descending deeper into a parallel universe of his own making, a world where the only companions he trusted were the instruments and the engineers who translated his visions into tape. He rented studio time by the month, paying for full calendar days even when he only used 2 days of recording, according to AllMusic, simply to preserve the acoustic fingerprint of the room he had grown to love, a privilege no other artist of the 1960s would have dared to demand. The studio became his sanctuary and his prison simultaneously, and the Wrecking Crew, that legendary collective of anonymous session musicians, became the real architects of the Beach Boys' most ambitious work, while the band members themselves were largely absent. Hal Blaine on drums, Carol Kaye on bass, Glenn Campbell on guitar. These were the invisible virtuosos who laid down the tracks that would become pet sounds, working with Brian through an intercom system and a pane of soundproof glass, while the actual Beach Boys added only background vocals at the very end. When fans discovered that their idols had not played a single note on the album that defined their legacy, the revelation landed like a betrayal. Yet the deeper wound belonged to Brian, who had traded his brother's companionship for the cold precision of hired hands, because he no longer trusted anyone to understand what he heard in his head. By 1965, the obsession had curdled into something closer to illness, with Brian spending an average of 12 hours each day in the studio, according to engineer Chuck Britz, demanding that microphones be repositioned for every single note, as though the physical placement of metal and mesh could somehow tame the chaos inside him. He would sit on a kitchen chair, dragged into the middle of the orchestra, feet tapping, head bobbing, oblivious to the musicians who exchanged bewildered glances, because they could not tell whether he was conducting them or listening to something only he could hear. The success of the Beach Boys was no longer a source of joy but a treadmill of expectation, each hit single raising the bar for the next, and Brian was running faster and faster toward a cliff he could not see until the ground simply disappeared beneath him. The cracks were visible to anyone who looked closely, but nobody wanted to look, because the music was too beautiful, and the money was too good, and the myth of the Golden Boys from California was too comforting to abandon. So Brian was left to fall alone, while the world kept dancing to the soundtrack of his unraveling. The archive reels from the Pet Sound sessions reveal a scene that unsettled even the most seasoned session players. Brian Wilson would drag a plain kitchen chair into the middle of the orchestra, place it dead center among the finest musicians money could buy, and just sit there, nodding his head and tapping his foot to bass notes no one else could hear. The wrecking crew, those hardened veterans of 1,000 hit records, exchanged uneasy glances because they genuinely could not tell if he was lost in the music or listening to something entirely separate, something that lived only behind his eyes. It was a portrait of total isolation, a man physically surrounded by brilliance yet utterly alone, and the discomfort in the room was palpable. The year before those sessions in 1965, Brian had met a man at a Los Angeles party who introduced himself as a doctor with access to something that could expand the mind. What followed, according to Mojo magazine's extensive reporting, was a regular diet of LSD and cocaine that he convinced himself was fuel for his creative engine. He treated these substances as though they were a laboratory tool, something to be measured and applied carefully to unlock the arrangements no one else dared to imagine. But here is the trap that snaps shut on so many gifted minds. The chemical that appears to open one door quietly locks every other one behind you. What began as an experiment in enhancement slowly transformed into a dependency that his fragile psyche could not afford, and the distinction between inspiration and intoxication began to blur beyond recognition. By the age of 23, the cost of that blur had become terrifyingly concrete. In 2020, during a rare interview with The Guardian, Brian finally put words to the nightmare he had carried for decades, confessing openly that he had been hearing voices in his head since that age, describing them as creatures that whispered relentless criticism into his ears. He admitted that these entities, as he called them, made it almost impossible to leave his house for 20 years, trapping him in a prison of his own neural chemistry, while the world outside wondered where the genius had gone. The silence of his disappearance was not a choice, it was a symptom, and the public misread his absence as laziness when it was actually a daily war for survival. Psychology offers a clinical label for what he endured, but the label hardly captures the lived terror. Experts at the University of California have pointed to what they call dysmorphic schizophrenia syndrome, typically triggered by severe stress, and they note that Brian's habit of referring to these voices as work voices in his songs was a coping mechanism, a way to keep the monsters at arm's length by pretending they were merely part of the job. He was not indulging in artistic eccentricity. He was building a fragile scaffolding of self-deception, strong enough to hold a collapsing mind. And the cruel irony is that this scaffolding, born of illness, became the very foundation of the music that would later be hailed as genius, leaving us with an uncomfortable question about the price of creativity. For every young musician who hopes to channel pain into art, the line between healing and destruction can become dangerously thin, and it is worth naming that line with brutal honesty. Drawing on the work of psychologist Stephen C. Hayes and Brian Wilson's own journals, a practical discipline emerges for those who want to create without losing themselves. First, recognize that the mild mania of hypomania might help you write quickly, but it will not sustain you, so set a hard limit of 4 focused creative hours per week and guard that boundary with everything you have. Second, extract your pain into themes and subject matter, but refuse to romanticize the use of stimulants as an essential tool for the process, replacing that illusion with deliberate breathing exercises that ground you in your body. Third, and this is the piece Brian used to dig himself out after 1995, separate your creative ego from your everyday identity by keeping a journal that records who you are when the work is finished, not just who you become while the work is in progress. Fourth, build a small circle of 3 trusted beta listeners who have no emotional stake in your output, and let them hear your unfinished work so you can honestly ask yourself who you are really writing for. The point is not to suppress the fire inside you, but to make sure it does not burn down the house it was meant to illuminate. In 1965, on a domestic flight over the United States, Brian Wilson listened to Rubber Soul by the Beatles and made a decision that would redefine his life. He halted his journey, got off the plane at Los Angeles Airport, and called the band to announce he would create a similarly cohesive album, a moment that became the seed of Pet Sounds. This was not a simple artistic ambition. It was the beginning of a spiral where genius and madness became indistinguishable. The pressure he placed on himself was immense, a direct consequence of a mind already fractured by a lifetime of paternal cruelty, and the music he was about to make would demand everything he had. Released on the 16th of May 1966, Pet Sounds reached number 10 on the Billboard 200 and number 2 on the UK Albums chart, yet it was considered a commercial failure relative to the enormous expectations set by its creator. The album was a masterpiece, a work of staggering beauty and emotional depth, but its modest sales figures only added to the crushing weight Wilson felt. He had poured every ounce of his fragile psyche into the record, and the world, while respectful, did not offer the overwhelming validation he so desperately needed. This silence from the marketplace was a wound that would fester, fueling the anxiety that was already beginning to consume him. In London, another musical titan was listening intently, and Paul McCartney of the Beatles was profoundly shaken by what he heard. McCartney called Wilson to express his astonishment, declaring that God Only Knows was the greatest song ever written about love, before returning to the studio to compose Here, There and Everywhere, a John Lennon would later call the best song Paul ever wrote. This moment of recognition, recorded in a BBC documentary, must have been a fleeting balm for Wilson's restless spirit, a confirmation from his most lauded peer. Yet for a man who was already losing his grip on reality, the praise was not a cure. It was just another signal that he needed to push further into the unknown. In early April 1967, in a state of panic and under the heavy influence of LSD, Wilson made a frantic phone call to McCartney at 3 a.m. London time to announce that he was cancelling the Smile album. The project, which critics would later view as the foundation of psychedelic rock, was being destroyed just weeks before the Beatles released Strawberry Fields Forever. McCartney, stunned, could only reply that he and his colleagues were sitting there in disbelief. It was a public undoing of a colossal work, a moment where Wilson actively sabotaged his own towering ambition, unwilling or unable to bring his most complex vision to life. The original release of Good Vibrations in 1966 cost the band between $50,000 and $75,000, an astronomical figure when the average cost to record a song in the 1960s was a mere $2,000. This single track, a monument to Wilson's obsessive perfectionism, was constructed in dozens of sessions with a vast array of session musicians, each segment meticulously assembled to create a sound never heard before. The financial expenditure was a clear symptom of his deteriorating mental state, a compulsion to control every sonic detail in a world he was increasingly unable to manage. It was a breathtaking piece of art, but it was also a beacon of the chaos to come. When a journalist asked Wilson in 1966 if he felt he was a genius, he replied with a devastating honesty, saying he was not a genius but merely a madman who sang dreamy songs and was afraid to go out and buy bread. This glimpse into his self-perception, captured by Melody Maker, reveals a man completely detached from his own success. The staggering cost of Good Vibrations and the doomed ambition of Smile were not just creative ventures. They were the final desperate acts of a mind unravelling at remarkable speed. The genius who had built a universe of sound was now buried under the rubble of his own expectations, leaving a broken figure where a legend once stood. The man who arrived to salvage Brian Wilson's life was on paper a saviour. Eugene Landy, a clinical psychologist with a flair for the theatrical, was summoned in 1983 to rescue a man who had become a ghost in his own mansion. The treatment began with promise, but the promise curdled into something far darker, a slow-motion hijacking of a broken genius. How does a healer become a jailer without anyone noticing until it is almost too late? The answer lies in the chilling details of a decade-long siege. By the early 80s, Wilson was a shadow of the visionary who had once commanded orchestras from a kitchen chair. His days were a fog of prescription drugs and fast food, his weight ballooning past 300 pounds, his mind drifting through a static of half-finished melodies. Landy's initial approach was aggressive and unorthodox, a 24-hour therapy regime that seemed to pull Wilson back from the abyss. Yet the doctor's methods were less about healing and more about becoming indispensable, the sole architect of Wilson's reality, and the financial records would soon tell a story of systematic plunder. According to music producer Joe Thomas, Landy helped himself to a staggering $100,000 every single month from Wilson's estate, a fee that would make any Wall Street executive blush. Worse, the psychologist reportedly demanded that the man who had composed God Only Knows address him as Dad, a grotesque inversion of the paternal authority that had already wounded Wilson so deeply. The manipulation was so brazen that it caught the attention of the Los Angeles Times, whose 1992 investigation peeled back the layers of a clinical relationship that had metastasized into a financial empire. Landy's control extended far beyond the balance sheet, tightening into a chokehold on Wilson's very connections to the world. He sold Wilson's original home and convinced his patient to purchase a more expensive property in the exclusive enclave of Pacific Palisades, a house that was quietly registered under Landy's own company for health monitoring. The result was a brilliant trap. Wilson lost both his sanctuary and his publishing rights, the crown jewels of his musical catalogue slipping into the hands of his captor's associates. And if anyone dared to intervene, they were cut off at the knees, as the songwriter Tony Asher, the lyricist behind Pet Sounds, discovered when he was banned from contact for fear of distracting the patient. The isolation was absolute, a quarantine enforced with the precision of a prison warden. Landy controlled every phone call, every visitor, every meal, and the medication list read like a chemical cocktail designed for sedation rather than recovery. He prescribed Thorazine, a powerful antipsychotic, alongside Ritalin, a dangerous combination that independent doctors would later describe as scientifically indefensible and potentially lethal for Wilson's heart. This was not therapy, this was a hostage situation, and the hostage was being slowly erased. The question that haunts every account of those years is simple. How could a man who had given the world such transcendent beauty be reduced to a ward of his own tormentor? But the darkest chapter involved the selling of Wilson's musical soul, a betrayal that stripped him of his life's work. Landy sold the print rights to several of Wilson's most beloved songs to his own company, a transaction that required no family approval and enriched the doctor at the artist's expense. This wasn't just theft, it was a calculated dismantling of Wilson's identity, leaving him with nothing but the hollow title of a genius whose creations now belonged to the man who held his leash. It would take a family's desperate legal intervention to finally crack the fortress Landy had built, but by then, the damage had been done. So here is the hard lesson buried in this horror story. When a therapist or advisor demands total control over a patient's contact with the outside world, when they forbid conversations about the treatment itself, that is not care, that is coercion. When the prescriptions escalate without proper monitoring of liver and kidney function, the warning signs are flashing red. And when money flows out of the patient's account and into the doctor's pocket with no oversight, you are no longer looking at a healer but a predator. Landy's reign would not end until 1992, when a court order finally pried him from Wilson's life, but the scars of that captivity would linger long after the chain was broken. The testimony from Brian Wilson's own lips, given under oath in 1992, painted a portrait of psychological imprisonment so complete that the man who had composed God Only Knows believed he would lose his mind if he spoke to anyone other than Dr. Eugene Landy. This belief, carefully cultivated for years, was the core of what the Wilson family's lawyers would later describe in their lawsuit as a form of spiritual kidnapping, a term that finally gave a legal name to the slow suffocation of a genius. A courtroom witness, an assistant who had watched all unfold, described the brutal mechanics of this control. Landy permitted Wilson exactly 8 minutes per day on a landline to the outside world, and every single call was monitored through a recording device and a speakerphone. When the judge, Kenneth Haig, heard this detail, he reportedly exclaimed that this was not treatment but a prison, a moment that stripped away the clinical veneer Landy had so carefully constructed. To be clear, the drugs were just as damning. In 1991, Landy was prescribing a cocktail of Thorazine, a powerful antipsychotic, and Ritalin, a combination that independent physicians would soon condemn as unscientific and potentially harmful to the patient's heart. How does a man who wrote the soundtrack to Summer become a prisoner in his own home, isolated by the very person paid to heal him? The emotional truth of Brian's situation was even more tragic, for the isolation was total, cutting him off from the brother who had always treated him like a person, Dennis. Dennis Wilson had died in 1983, and Brian later told reporters that his brother was the only one in the family who saw him as a human being rather than a music machine, a loss that made his subsequent captivity under Landy feel even more hopeless. The family had been watching this nightmare for years, and in 1992, Carl and Dennis Wilson, along with their mother Audrey, finally filed a suit with the California Superior Court. They accused Landy of using drugs not approved by the FDA and of exercising absolute control over every point of contact Brian had with the rest of humanity, and the weight of their testimony finally cracked the foundation of Landy's power. Facing this legal onslaught, Landy was forced to the negotiating table. By March of that same year, he signed a legal agreement that required him to end his treatment relationship with Brian completely. The agreement was meant to be a shield, and it also barred the doctor from coming within 100 meters of his former patient, a physical distance meant to mirror the emotional one that should have existed all along. Yet even in defeat, Landy would not admit his wrongdoings. He died in 2006, carrying his unrepentant secret to the grave, leaving a family to pick up the pieces of a man they barely recognized. For anyone who sees a loved one being similarly isolated by a trusted advisor, professional or otherwise, the first step is to document everything meticulously for 3 weeks, noting the schedule, the visitors, and the repeated phrases that sound more like the advisor than the patient. The next move is not direct confrontation, but a formal letter from a lawyer asking for the treatment protocol, because predators of this kind rarely have a solid answer for a legal challenge, and their fraudulent facade often begins to crumble under the scrutiny. In the United States, a family can petition for a temporary conservatorship within a week, a legal tool that exists precisely for such emergencies, while in other jurisdictions, a report to local authorities with the gathered evidence is the best path forward. Perhaps the most effective move is to cut off the financial oxygen that sustains the abuser by freezing credit cards and alerting banks to the possibility of financial exploitation. This practical framework, drawn from the very real history of the Landy case and the intervention handbooks of organizations like the National Alliance on Mental Illness, offers a lifeline to those who feel as powerless as Brian once did, proving that even the most captive mind can be reached if the rescuers act with patience and precision. For years, the man who had once crafted the most intricate harmonies in pop music could barely hold a conversation. He started by calling old friends, figures like Elton John and Paul McCartney, reaching out not to talk about music but simply to reconnect with a world he had been forbidden from touching. It was a slow, awkward and profoundly human re-entry, and he did not rush into a studio, instead spending these quiet years learning how to be a person again, piece by tentative piece. The real turning point arrived in 2004, not with a grand comeback tour, but with a quiet act of artistic redemption. After 37 years of being a legend defined by what he had failed to finish, Brian Wilson finally completed Smile, the album whose collapse had broken him, and in finishing it, he reclaimed a part of his own history that had been stolen. That same year, his masterpiece, Pet Sounds, was officially certified as an inspiration for over 60 landmark albums, with artists like Radiohead and Kanye West openly citing it as a foundational influence, proving the music had outlived the chaos that created it. By 2016, the offers for a nostalgic reunion were rolling in, with promoters dangling a staggering $50 million for a single anniversary tour, a sum that would have been irresistible to most. But Brian Wilson simply refused. He said, "I don't want to sell my memories," a single sentence that revealed a profound shift in his priorities, from commercial validation to personal peace. The family's decision to protect him from that kind of pressure marked a definitive end to the era when his genius was weaponized against his own well-being. 6 years later, at the Kennedy Center's 50th anniversary celebration in 2022, the man who once could not leave his house stood on a national stage to accept an award as a symphony orchestra played Good Vibrations. His daughter, Carney Wilson, watched a man who had been buried alive by his own mind finally step into the light, a moment she would later describe as seeing her father escape the shadows for good. The applause was not just for the music, but for the sheer improbable fact that he had survived the decades in between. The discipline that brought him back was not complicated. It was built on the act of writing things down, of separating the internal critic from the creative vision. By keeping a journal, he found a way to externalize the voices that had once controlled him, literally putting his anxiety on paper so it existed outside his head. This practice allowed him to view his own thoughts as objects to be observed rather than commands to be obeyed, a shift in perspective that was more therapeutic than any drug Landy had ever prescribed. He rebuilt his life with the same meticulous attention to structure that he had once used in the studio, establishing daily routines that provided a stable framework for a mind that had known only chaos. The method was not about silencing the darkness, but about learning to coexist with it, treating moments of creative obsession as pieces of data to be logged, not directives to be followed. The goal was not to become a different person, but to become the manager of his own extraordinary, fractured mind. Listening to Smile in its completed form now is to hear the sound of a man not merely recovering, but understanding himself for the first time, turning the raw material of his breakdown into a deliberate work of art. He had taken the very thing that had destroyed him and reshaped it into his most profound statement, offering a roadmap for anyone who has ever felt their own mind turn against them. The punchline to his life story is that the only way out of the wreckage was to walk very slowly back into the world he had once fled, not as the boy genius, but as the surviving man. Brian Wilson was never just a genius, and to call him only that is to flatten the jagged terrain of a life that refused to stay buried. He transformed the cruelty of his father's voice and the chaos inside his skull into harmonies that could make grown men weep without understanding why, but the price of that alchemy was almost everything else he had. In his own autobiography, he admitted that the strange sounds born from his depression became the symphony he could never have written while healthy, which forces an uncomfortable question. Does creativity exist independent of the illness that feeds it? Yet Brian stood before the United States Congress in 2001 and told them that people with mental illness are not lunatics but survivors, and he had earned the right to say so with every year he spent trapped inside his own home. The drugs were not what broke him, and they were never the real story, because the buried memory of his father's abuse was the thing that toppled him for decades, not the substances he used to dull it. We called him a genius buried alive, but that image was never quite right, because the man kept digging with his bare hands, and he left behind an escape route made of melody for anyone else who needed it. He gave us pet sounds, and then he gave us his survival, and somehow the second gift took even more courage than the first, because it happened without an orchestra or a studio to hide behind. His greatest song may not have been God Only Knows at all, but the quiet, unglamorous act of getting up one day and deciding to call an old friend instead of vanishing again. We can argue forever about where brilliance ends and sickness begins, but his life suggests they were always tangled together, feeding each other in ways that no clean diagnosis could ever untangle. What remains is not the tragedy of a broken mind, but the stubborn, defiant proof that a person can be shattered and still choose to keep composing, to keep breathing, to keep showing up long after the world has written them off. If you have ever felt the floor give way beneath you, or wondered whether the darkest parts of your own mind are worth anything at all, then you already know why his music refuses to fade, because he wrote it for you as much as for himself. So before you go, tell me what his songs have meant to you, and remember that the gentlest heart in rock history never stopped singing, even when nobody could hear him. That was always the sound of a man who had been buried, but never once agreed to stay in the ground.